Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there a paper on your desk tonight? A seal not yet broken? An answer you haven't quite reached? Watson found that even a locked drawer yields its secrets to a patient eye, and that snow outside a window keeps its own quiet record. Do subscribe so no document escapes your notice. Now, draw nearer the lamp, for as Holmes held, when the impossible is set aside, what remains, however improbable, is the truth. Find us also on Spotify. The link waits below. Chapter 1. The House Beyond the Drift. It has been my habit, in setting down these reminiscences of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to select those cases which best illustrate the singular quality of his mind, rather than those which offer the most sensational incident. Yet I confess that of all the problems which came to us during the hard winter of which I am about to write, none impressed me so deeply, nor tested Holmes's powers so thoroughly, as the affair of the Ashcombe Petition. It began, as so many of our adventures began, with a knock upon the door of our lodgings in Baker Street, upon an evening when the wind had already begun to pile the snow in white ridges along the pavement. I had not seen Holmes so idle in weeks. He had been occupied, for the better part of a fortnight, with nothing more taxing than the classification of tobacco ashes, and he had grown, in consequence, somewhat sharp of temper. It was therefore with an air of genuine relief that he rose from his chair when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor at so late an hour. A client, Watson, unless I am much mistaken, and one who has travelled some distance in wretched weather to reach us. Observe the manner of his knock upon the street door, twice repeated, as of a man uncertain whether he does right in disturbing us, yet resolved to do so notwithstanding. The gentleman who was shown into our sitting-room was perhaps 45 years of age, spare of frame, with the stooped shoulders and ink-stained fingers of one who has spent the better part of his life among documents. His overcoat was dusted with snow, and he carried beneath his arm a leather document case, which he set down beside his chair with the particular carefulness of a man guarding something precious. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I must apologise for this intrusion, but I did not know to whom else I might turn. My name is Percival Harcourt. I hold the position of senior clerk in the Court of Chancery, and I come to you upon a matter which, though it may seem to you a dry affair of legal papers, threatens to become something very much darker before the week is out." Holmes settled himself into his chair, his fingertips pressed together, his eyes half closed in that attitude of concentrated attention which I had learned, over the years of our association, to regard as the surest sign that his interest was thoroughly engaged. "Pray, let us have the facts, Mr. Harcourt, and let us have them in their proper order. A clerk of the Court of Chancery does not call upon me at 9:30 of a snowy evening, merely to discuss the tedium of his profession." "You are quite right, sir. The matter concerns a petition, the most consequential, I believe, that has come before our court in a generation. It relates to the Ashcombe estate in Hampshire. You will perhaps have heard the name. I know of Sir Reginald Ashcombe only as a gentleman of old family and diminishing fortune. Continue." "The petition," said Harcourt, leaning forward, "was submitted some weeks ago by a Miss Eleanor Vale, a young lady of respectable but modest circumstances. She claims, and I have examined her evidence with some care, that her late mother was the lawful beneficiary under a family settlement drawn up 2 generations back, a settlement which was, through some manner of deception, never properly recorded. Should the petition be accepted, Mr. Holmes, it would strip Sir Reginald of the greater part of his estate, and worse, it would expose an act of legal fraud committed, I believe, by his own father." "A weighty matter indeed, and yet you speak of it in the past tense, as though something has already gone amiss." Harcourt's hands, I observed, had begun to tremble slightly upon the arms of his chair. "3 days ago, Mr. Holmes, I went to retrieve the petition from its proper file, in order to prepare an abstract for the presiding judge. I could not find it. After a search of some hours, it was discovered, misfiled, inexplicably, among a bundle of unrelated papers concerning a shipping company dissolved these 10 years past. I cannot account for how it came to be there. I am a careful man, sir. I do not misplace documents. You suspect deliberate interference. I do, and there is worse. Fearing some further mischief, I took a certified copy of the petition, the original remains for the present secured at the Chancery offices, and travelled to Ashcombe Manor myself, that the family might examine it in advance of the hearing, as is their right, and that I might satisfy myself as to its safekeeping under my own eye. I arrived 2 days ago. Last night the snow began in earnest, and this morning I learned that the road to the village is entirely impassable. We are cut off, Mr. Holmes, the whole household of us, and I have come to you because I am afraid that someone within that house intends to see the petition destroyed or altered before ever it can reach the court. You left the house, then, in the midst of a snowstorm. I came away yesterday afternoon before the worst of it set in, upon a pretext of business in town, meaning to return this very night. But the last train from Waterloo that could connect with the branch line has already gone, and I find myself, absurdly, locked out of the very house whose secrets I fear for. He wrung his thin hands together. I do not know what to do, Mr. Holmes. I hoped, that you might advise me, or better still, that you might come. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed upon the fire. Tell me, Mr. Harcourt, who at present resides at Ashcombe Manor? Sir Reginald himself and Lady Beatrice, his wife, their son Julian. Miss Vale, the claimant. Sir Reginald, to his credit, has received her as a guest, that the matter might be settled among the family with as little scandal as possible. Mr. Gideon Marsh, the family solicitor, is also present, together with the Reverend Tobias Bell, an old friend of the house, and Miss Lydia Crane, who serves as Sir Reginald's private secretary. A full company, said Holmes, and every one of them, I should imagine, with some interest, however small, in the outcome of this petition. He rose abruptly and crossed to the window, where the snow was falling now in a steady, whispering curtain against the glass. Watson, what is the hour of the last train that will yet serve us tonight? I consulted the railway guide upon the mantelpiece. There is one from Waterloo at 11, Holmes, connecting with the branch line as far as Ashcombe Halt, assuming the branch line is still running at all in this weather. Then we have perhaps 40 minutes in which to pack a bag and secure a sleigh at the other end, for I do not think the local trap will serve us once we leave the station. He turned to Harcourt with something of his old briskness. You did well to come to me, Mr. Harcourt, though I would remind you that a man who fears for the safety of a document does not generally leave it 2 days in a house full of interested parties while he goes up to town. However, we need not quarrel over what is past. Watson, your revolver, I think. The roads in Hampshire are lonely enough in good weather, and this promises to be a night when respectable men might do things they would blush to attempt beneath a summer sun. I own that my old wound throbbed a little at the prospect of such a journey in such weather, but I would not for the world have been left behind. Within the half hour we three were in a cab bound for Waterloo, the snow already lying thick upon the streets, and Harcourt hunched in the corner of the carriage, clutching his leather document case to his chest as though it held the crown jewels rather than a certified copy of a Chancery petition. The train, when at last we boarded it, was nearly empty, and we had the compartment to ourselves. Holmes said little upon the journey, though I observed him watching Harcourt with that quiet, unhurried attention which those who didn't know him might have mistaken for idle curiosity, but which I had long since learned to recognise as the very reverse. It was close upon 1 in the morning when we descended, half frozen, at the small platform of Ashcombe Halt, to find the snow already a foot deep and falling still. A groom from the manor, roused by telegram, waited with a sleigh and a pair of stout horses, and it was in this fashion, muffled to the eyes and half buried beneath the driving snow, that Sherlock Holmes and I first approached Ashcombe Manor, a great grey pile of a house, its windows glowing faintly through the storm like the eyes of some patient and watchful creature, waiting, as it seemed to me even then, for what the night would bring. We were received, despite the lateness of the hour, with a civility so faultless that it struck me, even in my weariness, as somewhat remarkable. Sir Reginald Ashcombe himself came down to greet us in his dressing gown, a tall, grey, dignified man whose courtesy could not quite conceal the strain about his eyes. Behind him, in the lamplight of the great hall, I caught my first glimpse of the household that fate, or something less kindly than fate, had gathered beneath that roof, a handsome, restless young man whom I took to be Julian Ashcombe, a composed, watchful lady who could only be Lady Beatrice, a slight, dark-haired young woman standing a little apart from the rest, whom I rightly guessed to be Miss Eleanor Vale, and beyond them, in the shadow of the staircase, 2 or 3 others whose names I was yet to learn. "You're very welcome, Mr. Holmes," said Sir Reginald, extending his hand, "though I confess I do not fully understand why Harcourt has seen fit to summon you. We are, I assure you, a perfectly respectable household, whatever our present difficulties." "I have no doubt of it, Sir Reginald," Holmes replied, and I saw his glance travel, swift and comprehensive, over the assembled company, the hall, the staircase, the heavy oak door through which we had just passed. "Though I have observed, in the course of a good many years, that respectability and safety are not invariably the same thing." It was an answer that seemed to please no one greatly, and in the silence that followed it, I heard, from somewhere beyond the shuttered windows, the low and steady moan of the wind, piling the snow ever higher against the walls of Ashcombe Manor, and sealing us, all of us together, into whatever the house still held in store. Chapter 2. A company of respectable persons. Dinner at Ashcombe Manor was served that first night, with a formality which the circumstances scarcely seemed to warrant. I had expected, given the lateness of our arrival, and the gravity of the matter which had brought us there, some relaxation of custom. Instead, I found myself seated at a long table, beneath a row of ancestral portraits, partaking of a meal as correctly ordered as any I had known in the more settled houses of my acquaintance. It struck me even then as curious that a family upon the edge of ruin should trouble itself so scrupulously with the placing of the fish knives. Sir Reginald presided with a courtesy that never once faltered, though I observed that he ate almost nothing. To my right sat the Reverend Tobias Bell, a round, mild-featured gentleman of perhaps 60, who spoke a great deal about the parish and very little about the matter uppermost in all our minds. Across from me, Miss Eleanor Vale sat quietly, her eyes lowered for the most part to her plate, answering when spoken to with a gentle directness that I found immediately sympathetic. It was Julian Ashcombe who first broached the subject that lay beneath all our civility like a stone beneath a carpet. "I confess, Mr. Holmes," said he, with the easy insolence of a young man who has never wanted for charm, "that I cannot regard an old bundle of legal paper as anything very dangerous. My father speaks of this petition as though it were a loaded pistol. I should have thought a pistol a good deal more to be feared than an affidavit." "You would be surprised, Mr. Ashcombe," Holmes answered, "how many pistols have been rendered unnecessary by a well-timed affidavit." Sir Reginald set down his glass with some deliberation. "I will say before you all, since the matter must be spoken of, that I believe Miss Vale's claim to be founded upon a misunderstanding. An honest one, I do not doubt, but a misunderstanding none the less. I have no wish to see it resolved by anything but the fair judgment of the court, and I welcome Mr. Holmes's presence, if it will help to see that judgment reached without further mischief." "That is generously said, Sir Reginald," Eleanor replied, and I thought I saw a faint colour rise in her cheek. "And I have never wished for anything but the truth to be established, whatever it may cost me." "Old papers," Lady Beatrice observed, in the composed and faintly musical voice which I came to associate with her throughout that visit, "have a way of outliving the passions that created them. I confess I feel for Miss Vale a good deal more sympathy than my husband's position might strictly permit. It cannot be pleasant to have one's whole future decided by the accident of a filing clerk." At this Harcourt, who had said little throughout the meal, coloured deeply and applied himself with sudden attention to his plate. I will own that I attended to this conversation with the ordinary interest of a man dining among strangers, and no more. It was only in reflecting upon the evening afterward, in the light of what Holmes pointed out to me, that I understood how much had passed beneath the surface of that apparently idle talk. Holmes himself said little, yet I observed him watching the company with a stillness I had learned never to mistake for inattention. It was Miss Lydia Crane, Sir Reginald's secretary, who first drew his particular notice, a neat, composed young woman of perhaps 30, who sat some distance down the table and spoke scarcely at all, save when a question was addressed directly to her. Twice during the meal I saw her glance toward the tall clock that stood in the hall beyond the open dining-room door, and upon each occasion she consulted, almost furtively, the small watch she wore upon her wrist, as though comparing the two instruments and finding some discrepancy that troubled her. Mr. Gideon Marsh, the family solicitor, sat near Sir Reginald's end of the table, a heavy, careful man whose profession had written itself plainly upon his features, the permanent slight frown of one accustomed to reading small print, the ink stain upon the second finger of his right hand, when, after the cloth was drawn, Harcourt at last produced the certified copy of the petition from his document case, that it might be shown once more to Sir Reginald before being placed under lock. I noticed that Marsh, though he had handled 10,000 legal papers in the course of his career, drew back his hand as the document was passed to him, and touched it at last only with evident reluctance, using the very tips of his fingers as a man might touch something he suspected of being unclean. The Reverend Bell, for his part, grew suddenly vague when Sir Reginald asked, in the most casual manner, whether he had looked in upon the library that evening to find a volume of sermons he had mentioned wanting. I believe I may have done, said the clergyman with a small, uncertain laugh. One loses track of an evening in a house so large as this. I could not swear to it one way or the other. It was, I confess, only a trifling hesitation, and I thought nothing of it at the time. Holmes, I later learned, thought a great deal of it. The certified petition, once Sir Reginald had satisfied himself of its familiar contents, was carried by Harcourt to the library, where a heavy iron safe stood built into the wall behind a case of legal volumes. The safe, Sir Reginald explained, required 2 keys for its opening, one of which he wore always upon a chain at his waist, the other being kept by Marsh in his capacity as the family's solicitor. Both gentlemen affirmed, with every appearance of sincerity, that their keys had not left their persons since the safe was last opened, and would not do so now. "Excellent," said Holmes. "A precaution that does credit to your caution, Sir Reginald, whatever else the evening may have taught us." The storm, meanwhile, had continued to worsen, until the very windows rattled in their frames, and old Bassett the butler went about the house with his household securing shutter after shutter against a wind that seemed determined to find its way in by whatever means it could. It was near midnight, when the rest of the household had at last retired, that Holmes asked leave to examine the library once more before we too sought our beds. I followed him with a candle and watched him move about the room with that swift, silent thoroughness I had seen him bring to 100 other investigations. He knelt first beside the safe, running his fingers lightly across the carpet, and I saw his brow contract. "Damp, Watson, distinctly damp, and yet observe. There is no trace of melted snow upon the boards beyond, nor any mark to show that a wet garment has brushed against this spot. Someone has brought moisture into this room by a means I cannot yet account for." He rose and crossed to the bookcase that stood beside the safe, drawing his finger along the lower shelf and holding it up to the candlelight. A fine grey dust clung to his fingertip. This shelf has not been dusted in a very long while, and yet the dust lies in a single curious line, as though something had recently been drawn across it. Last of all, he took up the sealed envelope containing the petition, turning it gently beneath the light, and I heard him give a small, satisfied exclamation. "A crescent mark, Watson, pressed into the wax, the mark, unless I'm mistaken, of a thumbnail, and made, I should judge, within the last few hours." He set the envelope down and stood a moment in silence, his eyes moving slowly about the shadowed room. "What is it, Holmes?" "Only this, Watson," said he at last, "that I've dined this evening among 8 persons of the most unimpeachable respectability, every one of whom has behaved upon every point exactly as an innocent man or woman ought to behave, and I confess to you that when everyone behaves so very correctly, I begin to suspect that someone among them has rehearsed the part with unusual care. He said no more that night, but I observed before I slept that he sat long beside our bedroom fire, his pipe unlit between his fingers, listening to the storm. Chapter 3. The Empty Envelope. I was woken, upon the following morning, by a commotion in the passage outside our door, a confusion of hurrying feet and raised voices which drove all thought of sleep from my mind. I found Holmes already dressed, and at the window, watching the pale, snow-reflected light of dawn with the particular alertness of a man who has been expecting bad news and is not disappointed to receive it. "Harcourt, I fancy," said he, before I had spoken a word, and by the pitch of his voice, our fears of last night were not misplaced. We descended to find the library already a scene of some disorder. Harcourt stood before the open safe, his face the colour of chalk, holding in his trembling hands a sealed envelope which he thrust toward Holmes the moment we entered. "It is gone, Mr. Holmes. I opened the safe not 10 minutes since, meaning only to satisfy myself that all was well, and, see for yourself." Holmes took the envelope and turned it over in his long fingers. The seal, so far as I could judge, remained unbroken, the same crescent-shaped flaw in the wax which he had shown me the night before still plainly visible. Yet when he slit it open with the small knife he carried for such purposes, there emerged from within not the petition we had seen placed there some hours earlier, but a single sheet of blank paper, folded to precisely the same dimensions. "The safe itself?" Holmes asked, without looking up from his examination. "Shows no mark of forcing whatsoever," said Sir Reginald, who had followed us in, still in his dressing gown, his composure for once entirely deserting him. "I opened it myself with Marsh, not 5 minutes ago, each of us using his own key as we did last night. Neither key has left my hand nor his since the safe was locked. And the windows? Bolted from within, as they have been since the storm began. I examined them myself not an hour ago." This from Bassett the butler, who stood a little apart, wringing his hands in a manner that suggested long and faithful service now sorely tried. "The door, then? Who watched it?" "I did, sir," said a young footman, stepping forward with evident nervousness. "On account of the storm, Mr. Bassett set me to sit in the hall the whole night through, that no draught might come in unwatched through the library. I never left my chair, sir, not from 11 o'clock till 6 this morning, and no one passed that door the whole night that I did not see." Holmes regarded the young man for a long moment, and I saw something in his expression, not disbelief precisely, but the particular attention he reserved for evidence that did not yet fit the shape of the case. "You're quite certain, not even for a moment, to attend to the fire, perhaps, or to answer some small necessity?" "No, sir, I'll swear to it before any court in England." It was at this juncture that a housemaid, one Susan by name, came forward with evident reluctance to report that she had seen Miss Vale in the corridor outside the library shortly before midnight, a statement which fell upon the gathered household with the effect of a dropped glass. Eleanor, summoned at once, admitted the fact without hesitation, though her voice trembled as she spoke. "I did pass that way, yes. I had dropped a brooch, a small thing, of little value save that it was my mother's, and I went back to search for it in the corridor where I believed I'd lost it. I did not enter the library, I give you my word. It was Julian who, with a flourish that struck me as somewhat theatrical, produced from beneath a small table near the library door a slender gold brooch, which Eleanor identified at once as her own. "Found it not a minute ago," said he, "just where you'd have dropped it coming from the library, not going to it." He said this lightly, almost playfully, yet I saw the words strike Eleanor like a blow, and I confess my own sympathies, already inclined toward her, hardened further against the ease with which the young man made his discovery known. Holmes, meanwhile, had given his whole attention to the blank sheet taken from the envelope. He held it to the window, then drew from his pocket the small lens he carried always upon such occasions, and studied its edges with a care that seemed, to the rest of the company, wholly disproportionate to a piece of ordinary paper. "The weight is correct," he murmured, half to himself. "The size precisely that of the original. And yet, Watson, observe, the edges of this sheet are smoother than those we saw last night. The original petition, being an official document some weeks old, had been handled, folded, unfolded. Its edges bore the small roughness of use. This sheet has known no such history. It is new." He turned next to the envelope itself, tilting it beneath the light. "And the seal, gentlemen, was not broken and crudely replaced, as a clumsy thief might have done. It was softened, by heat I should judge, applied with some care, and pressed closed again while still pliable. A patient hand did this, and an unhurried one." It was at this point that Inspector Lestrade arrived among us, having been summoned, I learned, by Sir Reginald's telegram of 2 days before, and having reached the manor himself only hours ahead of the road's closing. He listened to the circumstances with the brisk satisfaction of a man who believes a case already halfway solved. "A copied key, Mr. Holmes. That's the plain answer. Someone in this house has had a duplicate made, and used it while the rest of us slept." "I think not, Lestrade." Holmes had crossed to the safe and now knelt before its lock, his lens once more in hand. "Observe the keyhole, if you will. The dust that has settled within it, a fine, undisturbed film, Watson, such as accumulates over weeks of ordinary use, remains entirely unbroken. A key inserted last night, however skilfully cut, could not have failed to leave some mark upon it. No, Lestrade, whatever admitted a hand to this safe, it was not a duplicate key." "Then how the devil was it done?" Holmes rose and stood a moment surveying the room. The safe, the bookcase, the damp patch still faintly visible upon the carpet, the grey dust he had found the night before, with an expression I had learned to associate with the earliest, most tentative stirrings of a solution. "You're asking the wrong question, Lestrade, and it is the most natural error in the world. You ask how the petition was taken from the safe. I would rather ask you this. Are we entirely certain that it was ever placed there at all?" The silence that followed this remark was, I think, the most uncomfortable of the whole strange morning, and I saw more than one face in that gathered company turn a shade paler at the suggestion, though for reasons, as I was soon to learn, that differed very widely from one to another. Chapter 4. The Clock That Lost 7 Minutes. Breakfast that morning was a subdued affair, taken in relays rather than together, as though the household had tacitly agreed that the ceremony of the previous evening's dinner could not survive so grave a shock. Holmes ate little, and spent the greater part of the meal in a silence which I had long since learned not to disturb. It was only when Lestrade joined us, brushing snow from his coat after a fruitless inspection of the grounds, that he roused himself to the business of the day. "We must establish," said he, "precisely where each member of this household stood, or sat, or walked, during the hour in which the petition was exchanged for that sheet of blank paper, and for that, gentlemen, we shall require rather more than memory. We shall require the evidence of clocks." It was a simple enough undertaking in its beginning. Miss Crane, summoned to the library, stated with some precision that she had seen Miss Vale pass along the corridor at 11:43, having herself glanced at the hall clock not a minute before. The Reverend Bell, questioned in turn, recalled hearing that same clock strike the hour of midnight while he sat reading in the drawing-room a volume of sermons, the very one, he added, that had drawn him briefly to the library earlier in the evening. Julian, for his part, declared that he had remained at billiards, quite alone, until 10 minutes past 12, when he had gone up to bed by way of the back stair. It was a tidy sequence, each account dovetailing with its neighbour, and I confess I saw in it nothing but the ordinary consistency of honest witnesses. Holmes, however, rose without a word and crossed to the hall, where he stood for some minutes comparing the tall clock against his own watch, and then, to my considerable surprise, went from room to room throughout the ground floor, consulting in turn the clock upon the drawing-room mantel, the one in the dining-room, and a small travelling clock that stood upon a shelf in the gun-room. "Watson," said he upon returning, "the hall clock is 7 minutes slow, no more, no less, when measured against every other timepiece in this house, and against my own watch, which I set by the station clock at Waterloo not 12 hours since. Slow, Holmes? Then every account we have gathered this morning is thrown out by 7 minutes. Precisely, and observe what that signifies. Miss Crane's 11:43 becomes, in truth, 11:50. The Reverend Bell's midnight becomes 7 minutes past. Mr. Julian's 10 past 12 becomes 17 past. Small differences, Watson, and yet sufficient, in a house where movements were timed with any care, to place a person very comfortably elsewhere than where the clock would have us believe. Miss Crane, when this discrepancy was put to her, grew pale and insisted with evident sincerity that the clock had shown the correct time when last she had occasion to compare it, some hours earlier in the evening. It was Bassett who at length recalled, with the slow, deliberate manner of a servant unwilling to speak against the family, that he had seen Mr. Julian standing before the hall clock after dinner, apparently adjusting its hands. "I thought nothing of it, sir. Mr. Julian said the clock was running fast and he'd set it right. It's not my place to question a gentleman about his own hall clock." Julian, taxed with this, shrugged with the same easy carelessness he had shown over the matter of the brooch. "I dare say I did touch the thing. It seemed to me it was gaining, and I set it back a few minutes. I hardly think a household clock is a matter for a court of inquiry, Mr. Holmes. You would be surprised, Mr. Ashcombe, how very often it is exactly that." Lestrade, meanwhile, had not been idle. He drew Holmes and myself aside with the air of a man well pleased with his own industry, and informed us that a wire received that morning, dispatched, it transpired before the roads closed entirely, had confirmed a fact of some significance concerning Mr. Gideon Marsh. He represented Eleanor Vale's father years back in some small matter of debt. And there's a whisper, Mr. Holmes, that he handled certain family papers for the old man that were never afterward accounted for. If Marsh knew all along what that petition might prove, and knew it would touch his own past dealings, why, there's motive enough for suppressing it, and no mistake. A motive is a useful thing, Lestrade, provided one does not mistake it for a solution. It was shortly after this exchange that a second discovery was made, one which seemed for a time to point the whole inquiry in a fresh direction. A parlour-maid, sweeping the hearth in the library, drew Holmes's attention to a small scattering of ash near the base of the bookcase, ash of a peculiar, dark, aromatic character, quite unlike the tobacco commonly smoked in an English household. "Balkan, unless I'm much mistaken," said Holmes, examining a pinch of it beneath his lens, "and there is but one smoker of Balkan cigarettes in this house, if my nose does not deceive me, the Reverend Bell." Confronted with this, the clergyman's composure, which had held through every previous question, deserted him for the first time. Yes, I did go into the library that evening after dinner. I have told you I could not be certain, and I am ashamed to say I was not entirely honest in my uncertainty. I wished only to find the volume I had mentioned at table. I took nothing, Mr. Holmes, and I saw nothing amiss." Holmes knelt again beside the damp patch upon the carpet, comparing it with great care against the position of the scattered ash, and I saw his brow contract in the manner I had come to recognise as the sign of some small but stubborn inconsistency. "The ash fell here, Watson, before the carpet grew damp. Observe how it lies undisturbed beneath the outer edge of the stain, rather than floating upon its surface or being carried away by it. Whatever wetted this carpet did so after the Reverend Bell had already come and gone." He touched the damp wool gently and raised his fingers to his nose. "And here is a thing more curious still. This is no ordinary damp such as melted snow would leave. There is a fine grit mingled with it, coal dust, unless I am much deceived, and yet I am told no coal is kept within 20 yards of this room." He rose and stood a moment surveying the library with the expression of a chess player who sees the board resolve itself into a pattern still one move short of comprehension. "We have, in the space of a single morning, gathered a motive against Mr. Marsh, an unexplained presence against the Reverend Bell, a broken alibi against Mr. Julian, and a witnessed but unproven wandering against Miss Vale. It is a very generous harvest, Lestrade, for one small room. Too generous, I think, to have grown there by accident." "You don't credit any of it, then?" "I credit all of it as fact. It is only as explanation that I find it wanting. When 4 separate paths of suspicion converge so neatly upon a single morning, Lestrade, I have generally found that someone has been at pains to plant them, and that the true explanation lies rather in who possessed the patience for such gardening than in whichever unhappy soul the flowers seem at first glance to point toward." He said no more upon the subject through the remainder of that grey and troubled day, though I observed him more than once standing before the hall clock, watching its hands with an attention that seemed, to anyone who didn't know him, altogether out of proportion to so humble an instrument. Chapter 5. What the Eyes Betray. Holmes announced upon the second afternoon that he intended to interview each member of the household separately, and I own. I looked forward to the exercise with some curiosity, having witnessed on many previous occasions how little he attended to what a witness said, and how much to the manner of the saying. We used the small morning room adjoining the library for this purpose. A chamber chosen, Holmes remarked to me privately, chiefly because its single window overlooked the unbroken snow of the terrace, and afforded no distraction to a nervous eye. Sir Reginald came first, seating himself with the stiff dignity of a man determined to preserve his composure whatever the provocation. "I have told you all I know, Mr. Holmes. I cannot account for the petition's disappearance, and I resent, though I do not blame you for it, the suggestion that my own household harbours a thief. I ask nothing of you, Sir Reginald, beyond a few points of confirmation. Your key to the safe. You say it has not left your person since the document was placed within. Never, sir. It hangs upon this chain, at my waist, day and night." As he spoke I observed, and Holmes afterward assured me he had observed it also, though with a good deal more precision than my own untrained eye could claim, that Sir Reginald's hand moved, almost without his own volition, to touch the breast of his coat, some inches above the pocket, a gesture repeated twice more in the course of our brief conversation, always at the mention of the safe or its keys. "You wear something else there, I think," Holmes said at last, gently enough. "Something you value a good deal more than the safety of a Chancery document." Sir Reginald's face coloured, and for a moment I thought he would refuse to answer. "A private letter, Mr. Holmes, of a purely personal nature, which has no bearing whatever upon this affair. I will ask you not to press me upon it." Holmes didn't press him, though I saw him note the matter with evident care before Sir Reginald was permitted to withdraw. Lady Beatrice followed, composed as ever, seating herself with the unhurried grace of a woman accustomed to being observed and unafraid of it. "I know nothing of legal matters, Mr. Holmes. My husband has always kept me apart from business of that kind, and I confess I have never had the head for it." "And yet," said Holmes, with an air of the most casual interest, "you referred, at dinner 2 evenings past, to the petition as the originating document, a term, if I am not mistaken, of some precision within the practice of the Court of Chancery, and not one that falls readily from the lips of those unacquainted with such proceedings." Lady Beatrice's composure did not desert her, but I saw a brief and telling stillness come over her before she answered. "I believe I have heard Mr. Marsh use the phrase in some earlier conversation. One absorbs these things without quite intending to." "No doubt," said Holmes, in a tone that committed him to nothing, and let the matter rest. Julian came next, lounging into his chair with the studied carelessness he had worn throughout our acquaintance with him. He laughed outright when Holmes returned to the subject of the altered clock. I've told you, Mr. Holmes, it was nothing. A boy's trick, if you like, and no more sinister than that. I can't think why you make such heavy weather of 7 minutes. But when Holmes, in the same easy tone, remarked upon the damp patch discovered beneath the library safe, I saw the young man's laughter fade with a suddenness that struck me forcibly. He recovered himself almost at once, reaching for a careless reply, but the colour had gone from his face, and did not fully return until Holmes had passed on to some other gentler question. Mr. Gideon Marsh proved, of all the household, the most guarded. He answered every question upon the mechanics of the safe and the history of the settlement with the fluent precision of his profession, yet I noticed that whenever the conversation touched upon Harcourt, upon the clerk's arrival, his manner, the circumstances of his bringing the petition to the manor at all, Marsh's eyes moved deliberately away toward the window, the fire, the pattern of the carpet, anywhere but toward the subject of his own words. The document would in any case be worthless without its court registration mark, said he, at one point, with something almost like satisfaction. Whatever mischief has been done here, Mr. Holmes, I do not think you will find that it much advances Miss Vale's claim. Harcourt himself, when his turn came, seemed to me the most wretched of all our witnesses, pale, restless, his thin hands never quite still in his lap. Yet Holmes observed to me afterward that his distress, real as it plainly was, carried within it a curious quality. He is anxious, Watson, most decidedly anxious, but he is not surprised. A man who discovers, wholly without warning, that a document he has guarded with his life has vanished from a locked safe wears a very particular look. I have seen it upon the faces of a dozen honest men in a dozen honest predicaments, and it is not the look that Harcourt wears. I had occasion, during that same interview, to notice for myself that Harcourt's shirt cuffs bore a faint grey soiling, of a texture not unlike the dust Holmes had found upon the library shelf 2 nights before, though I confess I should never have remarked it had Holmes not drawn my attention to it afterward, with a single significant glance. It remained only to speak with Eleanor Vale, and this interview, of all of them, moved me most deeply. She answered every question with a candour that seemed to cost her a great deal, and when Holmes asked at length whether she knew of any reason why the Ashcombe family might wish to see her claim suppressed by more than lawful argument, she was silent a long moment before replying. My mother told me, before she died, that she had once received money, small sums, sent quietly and without explanation, over a period of some years, from a member of the Ashcombe family whose name she would never give me. I have always believed it was conscience money, Mr. Holmes, paid by someone who knew that a wrong had been done her, and who had not the courage to write it openly. I believe the petition, could it be examined, would prove that Sir Reginald's father removed my mother deliberately and fraudulently from a settlement that was rightfully hers. Holmes asked her, then, to describe the petition itself, as she remembered it from the single occasion upon which she had been permitted to examine it. It bore the court's stamp, in blue, in the upper left corner of the first sheet, and there was a small tear, I recall, close beside the final signature. I noticed it particularly, because I feared for a moment that some word might be lost. On which side of the signature, Miss Vale? Can you be certain? She considered a moment, her brow furrowed with the effort of honest recollection. Upon the left, Mr. Holmes, beside the last stroke of my mother's name, where the paper had begun to weaken. I thought little of this at the time, until Holmes, consulting a small notebook in which he had recorded our very first conversation with Harcourt at Baker Street, showed me an entry made 2 nights before. The clerk had described the tear, upon that first occasion, as lying at the lower right edge of the final page. "They cannot both be correct, Holmes," said I. "One of them must simply be mistaken. It is no great matter to misremember the position of a tear in a document seen only once or twice." "You would think so, Watson, and in the general run of things you would be right. Memory fails us constantly in matters of substance. Dates, sums, the colour of a coat, the words a man used in anger. But a striking physical defect, seen with the particular attention that a claimant gives to the one document upon which her whole future depends, is a different matter altogether. Such a detail does not commonly reverse itself in the mind from left to right, or from top to bottom. When two honest witnesses disagree upon so small and so vivid a point, Watson, I begin to suspect that one of them is not remembering a document at all, but describing one that never existed in the form he claims to recall. He said no more that evening, but I saw in the quiet satisfaction with which he closed his notebook that some piece of the puzzle had at last slid into a place of its own choosing. Chapter 6. Footsteps Without a Traveller. It was upon the third day of our confinement, the snow having at last ceased to fall, though the roads remained as impassable as ever, that Holmes proposed to reconstruct, hour by hour, the movements of the household during the critical night. He did this after his own peculiar fashion, pacing the length of the hall with his watch open in his palm, correcting each remembered time by the 7 minutes he had already proved the clock to have lost, until what had seemed a confusion of overlapping and contradictory statements resolved itself, under his patient adjustment, into something very like a map. Observe, Watson, what the true hour does to these accounts, once we strip away the clock's small deception. Miss Crane's sighting of Miss Vale, corrected, falls at 11:50, not 11:43. The Reverend Bell's midnight becomes 7 minutes past, and Mr. Julian's claim to have remained at billiards until 12 becomes in fact 17 past, a full quarter hour later than he would have us believe, and later, I think, than is entirely convenient for him to admit. You believe he was in the library then, and not at billiards at all? I believe the billiard room and the library are less distant from one another than an innocent glance at the house would suggest. It was this remark that led him, within the hour, to a discovery which I confess astonished me a good deal more than it appeared to astonish him. Behind a false panel at the rear of the billiard-room chimney-piece, a panel which yielded, once Holmes had found the trick of it, to a firm pressure upon its lower left corner, there opened a narrow service passage, black with the dust of long disuse, which ran, by a crooked course behind the old servant's stair, to a small cupboard built into the wall directly behind the library bookcase. A relic, I should imagine, of some earlier arrangement of the house, said Holmes, holding his candle high to illuminate the low, cobwebbed way. Built perhaps for the convenience of servants passing between the two rooms without disturbing the family, and long since forgotten by everyone save, perhaps, those who had particular reason to remember it. The floor of this passage lay thick with grey dust of a kind I now recognised, from Holmes's earlier discoveries all too well. He knelt beside the cupboard entrance and studied the surface with great care, before rising and beckoning me to examine it also. You will observe, Watson, that this dust bears no mark whatever of Mr. Julian's tread, though his account would place him within a few yards of this very spot at the hour in question. His boots, which I examined this morning upon a pretext of admiring their workmanship, show not the smallest trace of it. Then he did not use the passage. So it would appear. But look here! He drew from his pocket a small brush and a fold of paper, and with these implements lifted with extraordinary delicacy a quantity of the grey dust from a boot which stood, drying, beside the library fire. A boot which I recognised upon inquiry as belonging to Mr. Harcourt. Beneath the instep, Watson, where the leather curves and no ordinary walking would ever carry it. A man does not gather dust in such a place by strolling across an open floor. He gathers it by crouching, or crawling, or pressing his foot flat against some low and awkward passage such as the one we have just traversed. I own that I felt at this discovery the first stirring of real suspicion against the unhappy clerk, whose distress had seemed, until that moment, so entirely genuine. Holmes, however, cautioned me against too hasty a conclusion. We have found how a man might have come and gone unseen, Watson, but not yet why, nor for what precise purpose. Let us continue. Within the cupboard itself, concealed behind a loose section of the bookcase's back panel, Holmes's searching fingers discovered a further piece of the puzzle, a small brass tube, some 18 inches in length and of a diameter sufficient to admit a rolled sheet of legal paper, fitted so neatly into the woodwork that I doubt I should have found it in a week of searching. One end opened, by means of a hinged cap, directly into the library. The other communicated with the service passage beyond. It was the matter of the damp carpet, however, that Holmes now turned to explain, and here I found myself following his reasoning with something of the pleasure I always felt when the separate threads of one of his investigations began, at last, to draw together into a single cord. A block of ice, Watson, carried through that passage and set beneath the safe to melt at its leisure. That will account for the damp and for its curious position, quite apart from any snow tracked in from without. And observe, when I first examined the stain, I noted a fine dark grit mingled with the moisture, a grit I could not then account for, there being no coal stored within 20 yards of this room. I believe now that the ice was wrapped, for its carrying, in a common coal sack, and that the grit is nothing more than the ordinary soiling of such a sack, transferred to the ice and thence to the carpet as it melted. But to what purpose, Holmes? A man wishing merely to remove a document from a safe has no need of ice, or coal dust, or an altered clock, or a passage sealed these 20 years or more. Any one of these devices might have served alone. That, Watson, is precisely the question that troubles me, and has troubled me since the very hour we found the blank sheet in place of the petition. A thief in a hurry destroys evidence and departs. He does not construct, with such patience and such variety of small deception, an entire theatre of impossibility around a single act of theft. It was at this point that Mr. Marsh, summoned to account for his evident familiarity with the house's older passages, a familiarity Holmes had inferred from the solicitor's unhesitating direction, given some hours earlier, when Holmes had inquired with seeming idleness whether the billiard-room chimney had ever been altered, made a confession that shed new and unhappy light upon the household's history. I have known of that passage for above 20 years, Mr. Holmes, and I have held my tongue about it all that time for reasons that touch the family's honour rather than my own. Sir Reginald's father used it in years long past for meetings he wished no servant to observe. Meetings, I need hardly say, with a lady who was not his wife. Eleanor Vale's mother, said Holmes quietly. Marsh inclined his head, unable, it seemed, to trust himself to speak the confirmation aloud. It became clear, in the hour that followed, that this old and unhappy history was known, in some degree, to a wider circle of the household than any single person had yet admitted. Lady Beatrice, questioned gently upon the point, confessed that she had long suspected the truth of her father-in-law's earlier attachment, though she had never spoken of it even to her husband. The Reverend Bell pressed further, allowed at last that he had known of the secret payments made to Eleanor's mother, having been, in his younger days, as curate of the parish, the discreet intermediary through whom certain sums had passed. Sir Reginald himself maintained that he had known of the settlement's bare existence, but had believed, in perfect good faith, that the relevant petition had been lost beyond all recovery, years before Eleanor Vale had ever thought to press her claim. It was, in short, a silent conspiracy of the most ordinary kind, not of villainy, but of comfortable forgetting, in which each member of the household had preserved his own small portion of an old and painful truth, and had preferred, until this last extremity, to let it lie undisturbed. Yet Holmes, standing once more before the empty brass tube with its two mouths opening upon two separate rooms, remained plainly dissatisfied, and said as much to me when at last we were alone. We have found motive enough to account for a dozen thefts, Watson, and a mechanism ingenious enough to satisfy the most exacting engineer, and still I am not content. If the thief's whole purpose was the simple removal of a dangerous document, why trouble with these? With an altered clock, with a resealed wax, with a blank sheet folded to the precise dimensions of the original. Every one of these devices required forethought, and every one of them, once discovered, points suspicion towards some person other than its true author. This was not a theft, Watson. It was a performance, most carefully staged, and I begin to suspect that its true purpose was not to make a document disappear, but to make its disappearance impossible to explain by any ordinary means. He fell silent then, staring into the fire with the fixed, inward look I had come to know so well, and I did not disturb him further that night. Chapter 7. The Petition in the Snow. The discovery that broke upon us on the third morning came, as such discoveries so often do, at the hand of the one person in the household least inclined to careful observation. Julian Ashcombe, walking the terrace before breakfast in that restless way of his, gave a shout that brought half the house running to the conservatory windows, and when I reached him, I found him standing over a small metal dispatch box half sunk in a drift beneath the conservatory wall, its lid sprung open to show, within, a folded legal document bearing, so far as a hasty glance could determine, both Eleanor Vale's name and the Ashcombe seal. "Well, Lestrade," said Sir Reginald, when the box had been carried within and its contents spread upon the library table, "here, surely, is your answer." Lestrade, examining the undisturbed surface of the snow from which the box had been lifted, allowed himself a rare expression of satisfaction. "There's no track leading to it, Mr. Holmes, not a footprint anywhere near, and the drift beneath is smooth as a tablecloth. It was thrown, then, thrown from an upper window in the night, and fell short of wherever it was meant to go." He turned the box in his hands and drew from a corner of its catch a small torn strip of dark cloth. "And here's the man who threw it, unless I much mistake this weave for anything but a gentleman's overcoat." The cloth was carried at once to Mr. Marsh, and matched beyond any reasonable dispute against a fresh tear in the sleeve of the solicitor's own coat, which hung, I now observed for the first time, in the hall beyond the library door. Marsh's composure, which had endured so much through the preceding days, broke at last and entirely. He sank into a chair, his heavy face working with an emotion I took at the time for the collapse of a long-sustained deception. "I will not have another soul suffer for what I have done," said he, in a voice that trembled despite his evident effort to steady it. "I removed the petition from the safe, Mr. Holmes, meaning only to protect Sir Reginald from the ruin of his father's old disgrace. I meant to destroy it, or failing that, to carry it beyond the grounds and be rid of it. But the storm defeated me, and in throwing the box from my window last night I misjudged the distance, and it fell short into the drift, where Mr. Julian has now had the misfortune to find it." "You knew the mechanism of the safe," said Lestrade, ticking the points upon his fingers with obvious relish. "You knew of the passage, you knew the family secret, and by your own admission you have already confessed to altering certain files at the Chancery office, months before ever this petition came to Ashcombe Manor." "I did so," Marsh admitted, his head bowed, "believing then, as I believe now, that some truths are better left buried than exhumed to serve the vanity of the law. It was, I confess, a confession of such apparent completeness that I saw in the faces around me, in Sir Reginald's, in Lady Beatrice's, even in Lestrade's own, an unmistakable relief, the relief of men and women glad to have arrived, however painfully, at the end of an ordeal. Marsh's knowledge of the safe's working, of the hidden passage, of the family's buried scandal seemed to answer every question the case had raised, and I own that for some minutes I shared in the general sense that our strange investigation had at last found its natural conclusion. Holmes alone remained apart from this general satisfaction. He had taken up the dispatch box and was turning it over in his hands, with an air so detached, so nearly indifferent, that Lestrade at length demanded, with some impatience, whether he had any objection to raise. "None whatever to the confession as a piece of theatre, Lestrade. It wants only the objection that it cannot be true." A murmur ran round the room at this, and I saw Marsh raise his head, his expression more startled than resentful. "You will observe," Holmes continued, holding the box toward the window, "that its upper surface bears a fine rime of frost, precisely such as forms upon metal left exposed through a cold night. But turn it so." He inverted the box, that we might see its underside and the recessed hinges beneath. "Here, where the metal has lain nearest the snow itself, there is no frost whatever, only the ordinary dampness of an object recently set into a cold and shallow hollow. Had this box lain buried in that drift since the small hours of the night, as we are asked to believe, the frost would lie thickest where the metal met the snow, not uppermost, where it met only the air. This box was chilled elsewhere, gentlemen, and set into that hollow a very short time before Mr. Julian's fortunate discovery of it. Lestrade's satisfaction visibly wavered. "The torn cloth, then, Mr. Holmes? You'll not deny that matches Marsh's coat?" "I deny nothing of the kind. I only ask you to examine the tear itself." He beckoned Lestrade nearer, and held the strip of cloth beneath his lens. A garment torn upon a rough catch, such as the corner of this box, frays along its edge. The threads draw and separate unevenly, as anyone who has caught a sleeve upon a nail may readily confirm. This edge, Inspector, is straight, clean and regular from end to end. It was not torn from Mr. Marsh's coat in any struggle with this box. It was cut from it, with scissors, and placed here to be found. The silence that greeted this second demonstration was, I think, more profound even than that which had followed the confession itself, for it carried within it the uncomfortable knowledge that a man had been prepared, however unwillingly, to accept the blame for a crime that the true evidence would not support. Marsh himself said nothing, his eyes fixed upon the floor, and I saw in his silence not the sullenness of a detected liar, but something nearer to bewilderment, as though he scarcely understood himself what force had driven him to speak as he had. "The confession is false," said Holmes at last quietly into the stillness of the room, "and the petition recovered from that box, unless I am very much mistaken, will prove upon examination to be false also. We are not yet done, Lestrade, with the business of Ashcombe Manor. Chapter 8. A most convenient guilt. It was some hours before Marsh could be persuaded to speak with any freedom, and when at last he did so, it was to Holmes alone, in the small morning room, that he made the admission which explained, if it did not excuse, the strange performance of that morning. "Lady Beatrice came to me 2 nights ago," said he, his heavy face drawn with the particular exhaustion of a man who has carried a burden not his own, "and told me plainly that if the old scandal of Sir Reginald's father came before the court, it would not spare Eleanor either. That the world would say her mother had been no more than a kept woman, and that whatever justice the petition might win her would be bought at the price of her own good name. She begged me to find some way of ending the matter quietly. I believed, Mr. Holmes, that if I took the blame upon myself, the petition might be allowed to vanish along with my own reputation, which I confess I valued a good deal less than I once did. You acted, then, from a misplaced chivalry rather than any guilt of your own. I acted as a fool acts, Mr. Holmes, believing that a lie told for a kind reason does less harm than a truth told for none at all. I see now how wrong I was." Holmes, satisfied upon this point, turned his full attention to the recovered petition itself, spreading it upon the table beneath the strong north light of the window, and examining it, sheet by sheet, with an intensity that held the small company gathered about him in a silence broken only by the hiss of the fire. "The paper," said he presently, "is of good quality, and made, I should judge, to closely resemble the stock used by the Chancery office. Yet it is new, Watson, new within the year, unless every indication of manufacture deceives me, whereas the settlement it purports to record is a full generation old. Genuine Chancery paper of that age would show, by now, the faint yellowing that comes only with time, and this shows none." He turned next to the blue stamp affixed to the upper corner of the first sheet, comparing it beneath his lens against a genuine specimen which Harcourt, at Holmes's earlier request, had reluctantly produced from his own document case. "An excellent forgery, gentlemen. I do not think one clerk in 100 would detect the difference by eye alone. But observe the ink itself, held to the light." He tilted the sheet so that the stamp caught the pale winter sun. Genuine Chancery ink of the period we are considering was mixed, as it has been mixed for 50 years, from a formula containing no trace of the modern aniline dyes. This ink shows a faint violet cast beneath strong light, that no ink of that older recipe could ever display. It is a chemical dye, gentlemen, developed within the last few years, and no more capable of appearing upon a document generations old than a modern motor car upon a canvas by Gainsborough. He passed at last to the small tear beside the final signature, the very defect over which Eleanor and Harcourt had so curiously disagreed but 2 days before. And here, I think, we come to the heart of the matter. The tear upon this recovered document lies, as you may all confirm for yourselves, at the lower right of the final page, precisely as Mr. Harcourt described it to us upon that first evening in Baker Street. Miss Vale, who examined the true petition with her own eyes some weeks ago, placed the tear instead upon the left, beside the closing stroke of her mother's signature. One of these two accounts describes a document that genuinely existed. The other describes this one. It was Lestrade, roused at last from the stunned silence that had held him since the frost upon the dispatch box, who gave voice to the conclusion toward which every eye in the room now turned. "You're saying Harcourt forged it himself?" "I am saying that Mr. Harcourt has had, from the very beginning of this affair, an intimacy with the appearance of the genuine petition which none of the rest of this household could claim. An intimacy explicable only if he examined the original document a great deal more closely, and a great deal more recently, than a mere clerk delivering a certified copy would ordinarily require. Harcourt, summoned once more before us, protested his innocence with a vehemence that struck me, even now, as very near to sincere. I brought that petition to this house in perfect good faith, Mr. Holmes. If it has been tampered with, the exchange must have occurred before ever it left London. Some other hand at the Chancery office, some clerk with access to the file. A theory not without merit, Holmes replied, with a courtesy that did not, I thought, extend so far as belief. Perhaps you would be good enough to show us precisely how you carried the petition from your document case and placed it within the library safe upon the evening of our arrival. A small demonstration, nothing more, that we may satisfy ourselves upon the mechanics of the thing." Harcourt hesitated, then complied, taking up the sealed envelope from the table and moving through the gestures of that first evening with the stiff, self-conscious precision of a man performing under unwelcome scrutiny. He held the envelope, quite naturally, with its waxen seal turned toward his right hand, in the manner that any right-handed man would find easiest and most habitual. Holmes watched this small performance with an attention that seemed, to the rest of the company, wholly disproportionate to its apparent triviality. When it was concluded, he took up the envelope himself and held the crescent-shaped floor in the wax close beside Harcourt's own extended thumb. "You will observe, gentlemen, that the mark pressed into this seal corresponds, in its precise shape and position, to nothing so exactly as the thumbnail of a man holding the envelope in exactly the manner Mr. Harcourt has just now shown us. A manner, I would remind you, in which the envelope was never once handled upon the night the petition was first placed within the safe, since upon that occasion it was Sir Reginald himself who received it directly from Mr. Harcourt's hand and carried it, without pause, to its resting place. The colour drained from Harcourt's thin face. I may have touched the envelope since. In the general confusion, a man does not measure every small gesture." "He does not," Holmes agreed, "which is precisely why such gestures betray him. You have handled this envelope, Mr. Harcourt, at some time after it was supposedly sealed beyond any further touch, and you have handled it in a manner natural only to a man very much at his ease with its contents." Harcourt said nothing further, and I saw in his silence, more plainly than any words could have shown it, the shape of a guilt he had not yet found the courage to confess. Yet Holmes, though he had brought the clerk to the very threshold of admission, didn't press him across it. He turned instead to the window, where the last grey light of the afternoon was failing over the unbroken snow, and stood a long while in thought before he spoke again. "One question remains, gentlemen, and it is not a small one. If Mr. Harcourt wished this petition destroyed, He had 100 quieter opportunities in London to see it burned, or lost, or simply mislaid beyond recovery, without ever troubling to bring it under his own hand into a house full of witnesses, in the depth of a snowstorm that would seal him in among them. Why construct so elaborate, so hazardous a deception, when a single match, struck in the privacy of his own chambers, would have answered every purpose far more safely? No one in that darkening room could offer him an answer, and I confess that I, for my part, had none to give. Chapter 9. The Reconstruction in the Library. Holmes gave orders that evening that the whole household should assemble once more in the library after dinner, and there was in his manner, as we waited for the company to gather, a quiet and settled certainty which told me, better than any words could have done, that the last thread of the case had at length come into his hand. "You will forgive me, Sir Reginald," said he when all were seated, "if I ask you to hear a somewhat lengthy account before any question is put. The truth of this affair, I think, will bear telling only as a whole, for its parts, taken singly, deceive as thoroughly as they were meant to." He stood before the safe, his back to the fire, and began. "The genuine Petition gentleman never entered Ashcombe Manor at all. I believe it has not left London since the day, some months past, when Mr. Harcourt first discovered it, misfiled among the papers of a dissolved shipping company. That discovery, however, was not the innocent accident he described to us in Baker Street. In searching those old records, Mr. Harcourt found something a great deal more dangerous to himself than a stray petition. He found proof that the original misfiling, 2 generations distant, was no clerical accident, but had been arranged and paid for by a junior clerk of that earlier Chancery office, his own father. A murmur passed through the room, and I saw Harcourt's head sink lower, though he did not yet speak. The elder Harcourt, I believe, accepted money to see certain settlement papers buried beyond discovery, and in doing so committed the very fraud that stripped Eleanor Vale's mother of her rightful place. His son, discovering this shame after so many years, faced a choice that must have seemed to him without any honest escape. To let the petition proceed to its lawful hearing would be to expose his father's name to public disgrace, and his own career, built upon the unblemished reputation of a Chancery family, to certain ruin. He resolved, therefore, to remove the true petition from the world, and to do so in a manner that would place suspicion everywhere but upon himself. "But he brought a copy here," Sir Reginald objected. "We all saw him carry it into this room." "He brought a forgery, Sir Reginald, prepared with very great care beforehand, and containing, as we have already discovered, one deliberate flaw. A tear placed upon the wrong side of the final signature. A small and calculated error meant to be discovered only later, and meant, I believe, to cast a shadow of doubt over Miss Vale's own memory of the document, should her account of it ever be set against his." Eleanor, who had sat through this recital with her hands folded tightly in her lap, looked up at this, her eyes bright with an emotion I could not at once name. Relief, perhaps, or simple vindication. "Upon the evening of our arrival," Holmes continued, "Mr. Harcourt made a show of placing the certified petition, in truth his forgery, within the envelope, and the envelope within this safe before Sir Reginald's own eyes. But the envelope he sealed had, I believe, already been prepared to contain nothing more than a blank sheet, cut to the same dimensions as the true document. At some moment, when he found himself briefly alone in this room, and a house so full of guests offers such moments more readily than any of us commonly suppose, he slipped the forged petition instead into the brass tube we discovered concealed behind this very bookcase, there to remain, safely hidden, until he had leisure to retrieve it." "And the passage, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade put in. "How did he come to know of it at all, a stranger to this house?" "I confess that point troubled me longer than any other," Holmes admitted, "until I recalled that Mr. Harcourt's earlier visits to Ashcombe Manor upon Chancery business connected with the estate were not so few as he first allowed us to believe. A careful man, gentlemen, examining old estate plans in the course of his professional duties, might very easily have come upon the record of a service passage built and later forgotten. It required only patience and Mr. Harcourt, whatever else may be said of him, has shown us patience in the most extraordinary measure. He turned next to the matter of the clock, and I saw Julian shift uncomfortably in his chair as the subject was raised once more. The alteration of the hall clock served Mr. Harcourt's purpose admirably, though I do not believe he contrived it himself. Mr. Julian's carelessness in adjusting the clock, for reasons entirely his own and entirely innocent, created precisely the confusion of times that allowed several persons to appear, by their own honest testimony, to have been elsewhere than they in fact were during the critical hour, and allowed Mr. Harcourt, moving through the passage under cover of that same confusion, to pass unnoticed and unaccounted for. "And the ice, Holmes?" I ventured, for this detail had puzzled me longest of all. What purpose could it possibly serve? A double purpose, Watson, as I have long suspected. Carried through the passage in its coal sack and set beneath the safe to melt, it produced a stain of damp mingled with dark grit that any observer must attribute at first glance to snow tracked in from without, or to some passage through the servants' quarters, a stain calculated to draw suspicion toward the very passage Mr. Harcourt wished discovered, but only after suspicion had first spread, as indeed it did, across half the household. He paused, and his gaze travelled slowly around the room, resting for a moment upon each troubled face in turn. "Consider, gentlemen, how faithfully that design succeeded. Miss Vale, seen near the library at a false hour, became our first suspect. Mr. Marsh, burdened with an old and guilty knowledge of the passage, became our second. The Reverend Bell, whose harmless visit to fetch a book left ash upon this floor, became our third. And when even these were not sufficient to end the inquiry, a staged dispatch box and a confession born of misguided loyalty very nearly closed the case beyond further question. Lady Beatrice, in urging Mr. Marsh to shield the family with a lie, believed she was protecting her husband's name. I do not think she ever suspected that she was, in truth, protecting the very man who had engineered the whole deception, nor that Mr. Harcourt had, from the very beginning, counted upon someone in this house being willing, out of love or loyalty, to take a false guilt upon their own shoulders. The room had fallen entirely silent, and I saw Harcourt's hands, resting upon his knees, tremble with a violence he no longer troubled to conceal. "There remains only the true petition itself," Holmes concluded, "which Mr. Harcourt has, I believe, kept close beside him throughout this visit, intending to destroy it at the first safe opportunity once the storm had passed and suspicion had settled elsewhere. You will recall, Watson, the leather document case he carried with him from Baker Street, and the curious fact, noted upon our very first night at this house, that snow lay along one edge of it only, though he swore he had carried it upright from the sleigh the whole way. A case resting evenly upon its base gathers snow evenly along its lower edge. A case tilted, because some rigid object within prevents it from sitting flush, gathers snow unevenly, exactly as we observed." He crossed to where the document case still lay upon a side table, and with a small knife worked carefully at the stitching of its lining until, with a final gentle pull, a hidden inner compartment came away, and from within it he drew a folded sheet of aged, yellowed paper, bearing a blue stamp gone pale with time, and a small tear, plainly visible beside the closing stroke of a signature upon its final page, the true and original petition of Eleanor Vale. Chapter 10. When the Road Opens. Confronted with the genuine petition, spread now upon the library table beside its own false twin, Harcourt made no further attempt at denial. He sat very still for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon the two documents as though he beheld in them the whole ruin of his careful design, and when at last he spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the anxious evasion that had marked it throughout our acquaintance with him. "I will not pretend, Mr. Holmes, that I acted from any motive you would call noble. I acted to save my father's name from disgrace, and my own career along with it. I told myself in the beginning that I was protecting an old man who could no longer answer for his own conduct, and that no living person would be harmed by a wrong left buried a second time. I see now how thoroughly I deceived myself. Miss Vale would have been harmed, and gravely had I succeeded, robbed a second time of what was rightfully her mother's by the very family whose earlier fraud my own father had helped to conceal. A reputation preserved by fraud, said Holmes, not unkindly, is merely fraud wearing a more respectable coat, Mr. Harcourt. It does not become honesty by growing older. I understand that now, sir, though I fear the understanding has come a great deal too late to do me any credit. Lestrade, who had listened to this exchange with the grave satisfaction of a man whose case has been made for him in every particular, rose at once to take the clerk into formal custody, and I confess that I watched Harcourt led from the room with more pity than triumph, for there had been, beneath his elaborate deception, a very human grief that I could not find it in my heart wholly to condemn. It remained only to see what the truth, once laid bare, would make of the household it had so nearly divided. Sir Reginald, to his very great credit, wasted no time in fruitless protest against the plain evidence before him. He turned to Eleanor, who stood a little apart from the others, her composure only now beginning to show the strain of all she had endured. "Miss Vale," said he, "I will not wait upon the formal judgment of the court to acknowledge what that document proves. Your claim is just, and I mean to see it honoured, in private arrangement between us if the law's slow process will permit it, and by the court's own ruling if it will not. I owe your mother's memory that much, and a great deal more besides." "I have never wanted for revenge, Sir Reginald," Eleanor answered, her voice steady, though her eyes were bright with tears she did not trouble to hide. "I wanted only that the truth should be known and recorded, so that no one might say hereafter that my mother's name was a lie. If you will grant me that, freely and openly, I ask for nothing more than what is justly mine." Lady Beatrice, who had said little since Harcourt's confession, came forward then and took Eleanor's hand in both her own. "I have played my own poor part in prolonging this concealment, Miss Vale, out of a wish to protect a family name that perhaps did not deserve so much protecting. I will not ask your forgiveness, for I have not yet earned it. I ask only that you believe I meant, however clumsily, to spare pain rather than to cause it." I saw Eleanor's face soften a little at this, and though I do not think the full weight of Lady Beatrice's earlier conduct was entirely forgotten between them, there passed in that moment something of the beginning of an understanding that I was glad, for both their sakes, to witness. Mr. Marsh, cleared at last of any true theft, did not escape entirely without censure, for Holmes was firm upon the point that a solicitor's duty to the law could not be set aside, however kindly the motive, in favour of a private and unlawful silence. Sir Reginald, for his part, undertook to retain Marsh's services still, observing that a man who had shown himself capable of such misplaced loyalty might, properly guided, prove the most faithful counsellor a family could ask for. Julian, questioned once more upon the matter of the clock, admitted his carelessness with rather more humility than he had shown before, and declared, with what I took to be genuine feeling beneath his customary lightness, that he meant to leave off such foolish tricks, and a good many other reckless habits besides, now that he had seen how near they had come to serving a scoundrel's purpose. The Reverend Bell, questioned last of all, confirmed at length the full history of the secret payments he had once carried between the Ashcombe family and Eleanor's mother, and in so doing closed, with evident relief, the final gap in a chain of proof that Holmes had built, link by patient link, from the very first evening of our arrival. It was upon the fourth morning that the storm which had held us all so fast within Ashcombe Manor broke at last into clear and brilliant sunlight. I stood at the library window and watched the drifts glitter beneath a sky of the purest winter blue, while beyond the gates a party of men from the village, armed with shovels, laboured to open once more the road that would carry us back to London. There is something, I've always found, in the first sunlight, after a long storm that seems to promise more than the mere ending of bad weather, and I confess I felt that morning a lightness of spirit I had not known since our hurried departure from Baker Street some days before. We took our leave of Ashcombe Manor that afternoon, Lestrade departing with his prisoner by an earlier train, and Holmes and I following at our leisure once the road had been sufficiently cleared. It was upon that homeward journey, as the darkening Hampshire countryside slid past our carriage window, that I ventured to remark upon the singular character of the case we had just concluded. It seemed to me, Holmes, an impossible thing from the very first. A document vanishing from a locked safe, watched on every side, with no mark of forcing anywhere to be found. I confess I do not yet fully understand how so plain a mind as mine failed so completely to see through it. You failed, Watson, no more than any honest man fails who's been taught, by a lifetime of decent dealing, to believe that respectable people speak the truth concerning respectable things. Holmes settled back against the cushions, his eyes half closed, though I knew him far too well to suppose he was anywhere near to sleep. The true error in this case, from the very beginning, was not a failure of observation, but a failure of assumption. Every soul in that house agreed from the first evening that the petition had been placed within the safe. Given so universal an agreement, who would trouble to ask whether it was true? Yet the whole edifice of the impossible crime rested upon nothing sturdier than that single, unexamined belief. Once I permitted myself to doubt it. The rest followed as naturally as water finds its own level. I turned this thought over for some minutes in silence, watching the last light fade from the snow-covered fields beyond the glass. A hard lesson, Holmes, for a profession built so largely upon the taking of testimony. A necessary one, none the less. Testimony, Watson, tells us only what people wish to be believed, whether from malice, or from kindness, or from the simple, blameless failure of an honest memory. It is the physical fact alone, the dust undisturbed, the wax imperfectly resealed, the frost lying wrong upon a stolen box, that tells us, without prejudice or persuasion, what has actually occurred. I have built what little reputation I possess upon no better principle than that, and I have yet to find an occasion upon which it has failed me. The train carried us on through the gathering dusk, and I set down my pencil upon the notebook in which I had already begun, as was my custom, the first rough outline of the account you have just read. A record, as it seemed to me even then, less of a crime than of a very human sorrow, dressed by a clever and unhappy man in the borrowed clothes of an impossible mystery. This is the end of the story.